Hello, hi. So, I am back after a bit of a delay to finish up this seasonal recap of The Magicians. And I just watched episode 7. And so, I have some thoughts. I'm excited to dive back in. So, let's go. One, I was very pleased to see that Julia finally got a quest. Um, you know, with all of the sexism of Fillory, it's cool that basically she had to take a quest from Todd, who didn't need to have a quest in the first place. But it's interesting that it's funny how whenever they do their magic, and it's always like there's going to be an effect, then we fixed it, but then afterwards, even though they fixed it, there's still some negative repercussions. It's interesting. I'm curious to see that as they get older and kind of have more life experiences, that they will stop doing stuff like that. But nonetheless, here we are. There is Fillory is now in danger, and magic is still running amok and unsafe to use. So now we have to deal with that new problem. Um, it was pretty cool seeing Finn kind of, you know, move out on her own and kind of establish a rapport with the fairies. And it's also interesting seeing how they deal with like history and how when stories are told over time, they change and morph really depending on who's telling the stories. And so like in this instance with the fairies and how, King Margot, like, I mean, she has a fairy eye, for goodness sake. So she definitely became an ally of theirs and, brokered this deal and kind of created this peace. But it's been 300 years. And so now that story has been changed because what likely has happened is that there were fairies who were not a fan of the humans and the royal folks and the humans and the fairies kind of having peace and coming together, and so they might have changed the narrative where it's not actually what happened, is what people think happened. And so it's very interesting to see how when history is written and rewritten, that whole part can become skewed. So it'll be interesting to see how the thing with the fairies goes now that they have gotten back in their good graces. But I do want to talk about the whole Dean Fogg returning. So it definitely felt weird, and so it was interesting to see that it was not Fogg from this timeline. It was Fogg from the previous timeline, because they all said that they can't just leave that realm where he is currently stuck. And um, it is probably not. Um, it's not her fault that Fogg is stuck in that. I mean, because then he basically decide to stay. Stuff is aggressive right now for them, and it's. I'm looking at my notes. I have my little notes that I take, and um, it feels like him trying to be sober in the midst of all of this stuff just kind of going awry, and then having an opportunity to kind of exist in this realm of a elevated state of consciousness where you can kind of be unsober, that it makes sense that he would choose that as someone who is trying to stop drinking, because things are rough and this is the time where he might drink, and so now he's not. And so it's always just interesting how the characters kind of take so much as their fault and look at like the things that other people decide that they might have been party to, but it all becomes like it's their thing, and they kind of hold it and make it this whole big existential crisis, when really Fogg was just kind of over it and maybe appreciated the opportunity to step out of his sobriety in a place where it's okay for him to not be sober, because it's a lot happening with break bills and magic and all of this stuff. It is interesting watching this Penny from the previous timeline kind of step into the role of leadership and actually want to see that through. Whereas Julia wants to go on the quest, wants to try to save Billary. And, they got into the argument about Q and kind of grieving his death. But it's like, well, Fillory was like their thing that they had together, and that made kind of their what looked like a misfit matching as far as like the types of people that they are, made it make sense. So it stands to reason that if there was a problem in Fillory, Julia's going to want to fix it, even if, whether it's about her grieving Q or it's just kind of the thing that was like their thing. So it makes sense that she wants to go off. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next episode when she gets there and kind of sees where everything is. And, poor Elliot and him coming back from, being basically a party to everything that that the god that was basically taking over his body had done, on top of now coming out and having to grieve the loss of Q, who was a great love of his. And so it's very interesting seeing how everyone is grieving Q, but also understanding the different nuances of the relationships that he had with folks, and then the folks that he didn't have relationships with. So like Penny, while he's like, it's sad and I get why everyone kind of feels the way they do, it's almost like he can't really understand because he isn't the current Penny. So he didn't have that trajectory Q the way that the Penny who died did. And so, watching everyone kind of move through their grief and, seeing everything kind of come together, it'll be very interesting to watch what happens next. One thing I do want to say that I wrote down was, going back to them kind of moving the moon, and even though they were able to put it back, the after effects. And it's like, I wrote, did they not research this? It's always funny how watching the shows watching the magicians in the different episodes where like they do all of this exhaustive research, like they're reading all these books, they're, doing all of this, looking into stuff and all of this, and then like the one kind of big small thing no one looked into, no one decided to ask, like, well, what happens if we do move it but then move it back? Like, will that be okay, or will there be negative ramifications and everything will still kind of crash and burn? And so it's interesting seeing their blind spots. So this episode was definitely a ride, with the Dean Fogg of Timeline 17 and then the Todd of Timeline 17 ultimately exploding when he stepped in a landmine, it was like aggressive but funny. So that was weird. And then say Penny and Julia break up, which honestly, I understood why she agreed to try with him, but it felt very forced. It felt very much like he was trying to force a relationship that existed in his timeline to fit this timeline, which it's not the same Julia. Like in this timeline, he was like deeply in love with Katie. So it's like, how are you gonna go show up and then kind of expect things to shift, and then Julia tried to make it work, and she's not the same person. And so it's sad that they broke up, but it's kind of good because they need to find their footing separate. And if for whatever reason they kind of find their way back to each other through more natural terms where it just kind of happens, that will make more sense rather than trying to like force it because we had this great love in another timeline, but we're different versions of ourselves. And the Penny and Julia of this timeline were cool, but they weren't involved or trying to kick it because he was with Katie. So it's like, it just felt awkward. So I'm glad, it's sad they broke up. I'm glad that did happen just because it makes more sense. And if they're going to come back together, let it be more organic, So let's see what happens in episode 8. I'm very excited to see where we're going to go with this, what we're going to do with, this new knowledge and insight, but also how they're going to fix the Fillery situation. Because, okay, just I'm making a loose prediction. I don't think that the quest that Julia is now taking from Todd to save Fillory, I actually don't think it has anything to do with the Dark King. I think the Dark King is an issue, is something that they're going to have to wrestle with, but I think the Dark King situation is really going to be more about Elliot, and there's something else that's threatening Fillory that's not him. Or if it is him, it's like connected to him, but he's not the big bad thing here. There is another big bad thing. So I'm interested to see if that's going to happen. So yeah, I will be back to recap episode 8 of season 5 of The Magician. So this is wrapping up, just so that this doesn't sound confusing as an end, but closing out episode 7 of The Magicians, and I'm looking forward to see what happens in episode 8.